In the frozen heart of northern Minnesota Territory, near the Canadian border in the winter of 1883, a logging camp buzzed with mockery over Anders Lindström's latest folly. The Swedish immigrant, a 34-year-old stonemason who'd turned to timber work after finding little call for his trade on the frontier, had spent the entire previous summer constructing what the men called his stone puzzle house. While every other logger bunked in the standard rectangular cabins of chinked logs, Anders had built himself a six-sided dwelling of fitted fieldstone, each wall meeting the next at angles that made the other men shake their heads. The camp foreman, Jack Merritt, whose own cabin sat about 200 yards downslope, had watched the construction with increasing bewilderment, finally declaring at the autumn harvest feast that Anders had either too much time or too little sense. The other loggers, scattered across clearings within shouting distance of each other, agreed with rough laughter. They'd all built their homes the way their fathers had, the way every sensible man did, with good straight logs notched at the corners and gaps packed with moss and clay. Anders's peculiar structure seemed like a waste of back-breaking labor, dragging all those river stones up from the creek bed when perfectly good timber surrounded them on every side. But Anders had noticed something during his first winter in camp, something that gnawed at him through those long months when the temperature dropped so low that spit froze before it hit the ground. The rectangular log cabins, for all their traditional reliability, had a weakness. The corners where four separate log ends met never quite sealed properly, no matter how much chinking went into them. Cold air found those joints like water finding cracks in stone. He'd watched men wake with frost on their beards from their own breath freezing in the night, even with fires burning steady. He'd seen how much cordwood vanished into those hearths, how the walls nearest the fire baked while the corners stayed cold as January creek water. Anders had worked stone since he was 12 years old in Värmland, building walls and foundations that stood against Swedish winters that could break lesser materials. He understood how stone held heat once it absorbed it, how it gave that warmth back slowly through the night, like a patient friend. But it was the shape that really mattered, the geometry he'd puzzled over during the quiet summer evenings. A six-sided structure, he reasoned, had no true corners in the way a rectangle did. Each wall supported the next at a gentler angle, creating a space where heat could circulate without getting trapped in far corners or lost through weak joints. The stones themselves, fitted tight as a barrel stave, would absorb the fire's warmth during the evening and radiate it back through the small hours when a man needed it most. When he tried to explain this to the other men, they'd looked at him like he'd been drinking too much of the medicinal whiskey. Tom Bradford, whose cabin stood nearest to Anders's chosen site, maybe 300 yards east, had said outright that Anders was making work where none was needed. A good log cabin had served men for generations, he argued, and if the corners got cold, well, that's what more firewood was for. The forest wasn't going anywhere, but Anders couldn't let it go. He'd spent too many nights shivering in borrowed bunks, watching other men feed log after log into fires that seemed to heat the sky more than the room. When spring finally broke and the crews prepared for the new season's work, Anders made his decision. He would build his stone cabin, even if the whole camp thought him mad. The isolation that followed was harder than the physical work. Men he'd shared meals with began taking their coffee elsewhere. When he asked for help dragging stones, he got only shrugs and reminders that everyone had their own preparations to make for winter. Even Jack Merritt, who'd always been fair enough, stopped by one morning to suggest kindly but firmly that Anders might want to reconsider before he wasted his whole summer on a fool's experiment. The social cost weighed on Anders more than he'd expected. He was not a man who enjoyed solitude, and the looks he got when he came to the main camp for supplies made him question himself more than once. His wife, Ingrid, had passed during their second winter in America, and he'd come to the logging camps partly to escape that loneness. Now, he'd created a different kind of isolation, one built on stubbornness and what others saw as prideful stupidity. The men's skepticism wasn't baseless from their perspective. Everything about Anders's plan seemed backwards. Stone was harder to work than wood, harder to shape, harder to haul. A log cabin could go up in weeks. Anders's project would consume months. And for what? A house shaped like no house they'd ever seen, built by a man who worked stone when stone wasn't needed, who insisted on doing things differently just to be different. That's how it looked to them, anyway. The camp had its rhythms, its established ways of surviving the brutal Minnesota winters. They knew what worked because they'd seen it work. Fathers had built log cabins, sons built log cabins, and everyone made it through to spring with fingers and toes intact, more or less. Why would a man choose to spend his summer wrestling with rocks when he could be putting away extra cordwood or improving his lot in sensible ways? Some thought Anders missed his old work so much he'd invented a reason to do it, even where it made no sense. Others figured his grief had touched his mind, made him contrary. A few simply wrote him off as the kind of man who had to learn things the hard way, who wouldn't accept wisdom until the frost bit him hard enough to teach respect for tradition. But Anders had seen those corners let in the cold, had felt how log walls only stayed warm where the fire touched them directly, and he couldn't unsee it, couldn't unfeel it. So he pressed on alone, knowing the coming winter would be his only advocate. That summer of 1883 burned hot, even by the standards of northern Minnesota. Anders began in late May, as soon as the ground thawed enough to dig a proper foundation. He spent the first 2 weeks just gathering stones from the creek bed about half a mile downslope, a journey he made so many times he wore a visible path through the underbrush. He chose rounded river stones mostly, each one hefty enough to need both hands, looking for pieces that fit together like the bones of a spine. The selection mattered because he couldn't trim them the way he might have with quarried stone. These were what the land gave him, and he had to make them work together. By his rough count, he figured he moved something close to 4 tons of stone in those first weeks alone, hauling them up the slope in a makeshift sled he'd fashioned from split logs. The work left his shoulders aching in ways the axe and saw never had. Where he could, Anders used timber to spare his back. He cut straight young pines for floor joists, maybe 18 of them, each as thick around as his forearm and long enough to span the space he'd paced out. For the roof frame, he chose slightly stouter timber, pieces that would bear the weight of sod and snow through the winter months. But the walls, those he built from stone, starting from his foundation and working upward one course at a time. He'd learned the mason's craft properly back in Sweden, so he knew how to find the balance point in each stone, how to set them so they locked together with minimal gaps. Where gaps did appear, he mixed clay from the creek banks with dried grass, pressing it into the joints the way his father had taught him. The walls rose slowly, much slower than a log cabin would have. A good crew could raise a log structure in 3 weeks if they pushed. Anders worked alone through June and into July, sometimes managing only a foot of wall height in a week when the stones proved stubborn. He built his 6 walls simultaneously, keeping them level as he went, checking his angles with a plumb line and simple geometry he'd scratched out on a piece of bark. Each wall ran about 8 feet long, and he'd planned for walls to stand 7 feet high at the lowest point, rising slightly toward the center to support the roof pitch. The shape itself drew the most criticism from the men who occasionally stopped by to watch. Why 6 sides instead of 4? Anders tried to explain about the angles, about how heat moves around a space, and how corners trap cold air in pockets, but he could see their eyes glaze over. They'd nod politely, and then as they walked away, he'd hear them muttering to each other about the extra work those angles created, all those cuts and joints just to avoid building a decent rectangle. The roof was simpler than the walls, but still took considerable time. Anders laid poles from wall to wall, creating a frame that sloped gently toward the center where he'd left a gap for a chimney. Over the poles went smaller branches woven tight, then a layer of birch bark he'd peeled the previous spring, then sod he cut from the meadow east of camp. The whole thing, once complete, looked more like a small hillock than a cabin, just a grassy mound with smoke coming out the top. Inside, he'd left himself a single room maybe 18 feet across at the widest point, with a stone hearth he'd built against one wall, venting up through that central chimney. The floor was packed earth, covered with split logs, and he'd framed one proper window facing south, filling it with oiled paper that let light through without letting weather in. By the time the first yellow leaves appeared on the birch trees, Anders had his peculiar cabin complete. The whole project had consumed nearly 4 months of work, countless trips to the creek for stone and clay, and more solitary evenings than he cared to count. When Jack Merritt came by to inspect the finished structure, he walked around it twice, arms crossed, then offered his assessment. "Well," he said, "it'll either be the warmest cabin in camp or the finest tomb. Either way, you built it solid." The other men were less charitable in their commentary. At the Saturday evening gathering where the loggers shared whiskey and told stories, Tom Bradford raised his cup toward Anders and declared that they'd all better remember where the stone cabin stood, because come spring, They might need to dig him out if the whole thing collapsed under the snow. The laughter that followed was good-natured enough on the surface, but Anders felt the edge in it. As autumn deepened and the first hard frosts arrived, Anders began spending his evenings in the new cabin, testing how it held heat compared to the log bunkhouses where he'd previously stayed. The early results surprised even him. On nights when the temperature dropped enough to make breath visible, Anders found he could let his fire burn down to coals by midnight and still wake in relative comfort at dawn. The stones had absorbed the evening's heat and gave it back steadily through the dark hours. He burned maybe half the wood he'd used in previous winters, and the cold spots he'd always fought against, those corners where blankets never seemed warm enough, simply didn't exist in the round space. The temperature inside stayed remarkably even, warm near the fire certainly, but not icy in the spaces away from it. Tom Bradford stopped by one October morning and accepted Anders's invitation to come inside and feel the difference himself. He stood there in his coat, looking around at the stone walls, the curved space, and finally admitted that yes, it did seem to hold heat better than his own place. But we haven't hit real cold yet, Tom said, unable to quite give up his skepticism. Wait until January. That's when we'll see if those stones keep you warm or just make a cold grave. Anders didn't argue. He understood why the cabin worked, at least in practical terms that made sense to him, even if he couldn't put it into engineer's language. The stones acted like a wood stove's iron, soaking up heat when the fire burned strong and releasing it back when the fire died down. That steady give and take meant the temperature inside stayed more stable, didn't swing from roasting to freezing the way a log cabin did. The six-sided shape kept the warmth circulating instead of getting trapped in corners where it did nobody any good. And those angles, the way each wall braced the next, created a structure that simply had fewer weak points than four corners ever could. It was like wearing layers of wool rather than one heavy coat, each piece doing its small part to keep the warmth close. A root cellar stayed cool in summer by the same principle, the earth around it absorbing and holding the temperature steady. Anders's cabin worked in reverse, holding warmth instead of coolness, but the idea was similar. The other men watched with growing curiosity as autumn turned to early winter, but their doubt remained strong. They'd see Anders outside with a modest stack of firewood while they hauled load after load to their own cabins, and they figured he'd regret his small supply come January. What they couldn't see was that inside those stone walls, the heat lingered in a way it never did in wood. The older loggers, men who'd spent 20 winters in camps from Michigan to Minnesota, told anyone who'd listen that stone was fine for a forge or a hearth, but no sensible man built his whole house from it. Too much work, too cold in winter, too damp in spring. They'd cite examples of stone houses down in the settlements that always felt clammy and unwelcoming. Anders didn't try to convince them otherwise. He just went about his preparations for winter, stacking wood under his small lean-to, hanging herbs to dry from his rafters, and keeping his own counsel. The gap between Anders and the rest of camp had grown wider over those months, a social distance that matched the physical space between the cabins. Men who'd once invited him to their card games now seemed to forget to mention them. When he joined the evening gatherings, conversation often died down until someone found a new topic. It wasn't cruelty exactly, just the natural consequence of a man who insisted on doing things his own way. The frontier had room for eccentrics, but it didn't always embrace them. So Anders spent his evenings alone in his stone cabin, reading by firelight and watching the walls give back their stored heat, waiting for the winter that would prove him right or make him a cautionary tale. The winter of 1883 into 1884 started mild enough by Minnesota standards, cold but manageable, the kind of weather where a man could still work outside for a few hours without losing feeling in his fingers. But by late December, the older loggers began noticing signs that worried them. The spruce trees carried more cones than usual, and the squirrels had cached food frantically since October. The ravens, normally bold scavengers, had moved south weeks earlier than their normal pattern. Even the domestic animals seemed nervous, horses stamping in their stalls for no clear reason, dogs staying close to fires. Jack Merritt, who'd seen 40 winters in his 52 years, told the men at the Christmas gathering that his grandfather had taught him to watch for these signs. When the animals knew something, he said, smart men paid attention. The camp took the warnings seriously enough to double-check their woodpiles and provisions. By early January, The cold began arriving in earnest, dropping day by day like a weight pressing down on the land. The first week of 1884 brought temperatures cold enough that the men's beards frosted white just from breathing, and the sound of trees splitting in the night became so common that nobody startled at the sharp cracks anymore. But this was just the beginning. Old-timers swapped stories of legendary freezes, winters when the cold got so deep that whiskey froze solid in the bottle, when men lost ears and noses just from a short walk between buildings. They'd seen bad winters, but there were rumors of worse ones, the kind that came maybe once in a generation. By mid-January, the temperature had fallen so far that ordinary activities became dangerous. Stepping outside without proper covering could frost a man's lungs. The logging work stopped entirely because the saws froze and the trees became brittle as glass. The camp turned inward, each cabin becoming its own small fortress against the killing cold. Inside Anders's stone cabin, life remained surprisingly comfortable. He'd built up a good fire in the morning, let it burn through the day, and by evening, the walls themselves felt warm to the touch. He could bank the coals at night and wake to a space that never dropped below bearable, where his breath barely misted and his water bucket only skinned over with ice rather than freezing solid. He burned maybe 4 logs a day, sometimes 5 if he wanted real warmth, but nothing like the constant feeding that fires required in the log cabins. Outside his door, he could hear the other men working continuously, the sound of axes splitting wood carrying clear in the frozen air. Tom Bradford's cabin, the nearest to his, had smoke pouring from the chimney day and night, a sure sign of constant fire feeding. The log bunkhouses where the unmarried men slept together had it worse. Those structures, built quick and functional, chinked with whatever was handy, leaked cold through every gap. The men inside took shifts keeping the fire going, and even then they slept in their coats, huddled together for warmth. Anders heard later that they were burning through 20 logs a night, maybe more, just to keep the space above freezing. In Tom Bradford's cabin, the situation was growing desperate in its own way. Tom lived there with his wife Sarah and their 2 young children, and Anders could see from the smoke and the activity that they were fighting a losing battle against the cold. Sarah had been sick since Christmas, with a cough that wouldn't leave, and the constant cold couldn't have been helping. Then, in the 3rd week of January, the cold deepened beyond anything the camp had experienced. The thermometer that hung outside Jack Merritt's office stopped registering one morning. The mercury contracted so far down the scale that it disappeared below the final mark. Men who stepped outside felt the air seize their chests, felt their eyelashes try to freeze together. This was the cold the old-timers had whispered about, the kind that killed quickly if you weren't careful, that found any weakness in a structure and exploited it ruthlessly. Inside Anders's stone cabin, he went about his routine with a calmness that felt almost surreal given what he knew was happening outside. The walls radiated a steady, gentle warmth that kept the small space comfortable. He fed his fire twice a day, morning and evening, and the stones did the rest of the work. The air inside stayed dry and breathable, warm enough that he could sit in his shirt sleeves while working at his small table, something that would have been impossible in any log cabin during weather like this. But outside his walls, the camp was suffering. The log cabins, for all their traditional design, simply couldn't hold heat against this level of cold. Tom Bradford's family was burning through their wood supply at an alarming rate, and little good it was doing. The corners of their cabin, where 4 log ends met imperfectly, let in streams of cold air that no amount of chinking could fully stop. The children slept between their parents for warmth, bundled in every blanket the family owned, and still they shivered. Sarah's cough had worsened, her breathing ragged and pained. The bunkhouses were even worse. The unmarried men had given up trying to keep the whole space warm, and instead focused their fire on one end of the long building, abandoning the other half to the cold. They slept in shifts, some men tending the fire while others huddled as close to it as they could without setting their blankets alight. The wood consumption was staggering, and men began eyeing the structural timbers of the building itself, wondering how long until they started burning those just to survive. On the 4th night of the extreme cold, around midnight by Anders's pocket watch, he heard a desperate pounding on his door. He opened it to find Tom Bradford standing there, frost covering his beard and eyebrows, shaking so hard he could barely speak. "Please," Tom managed through chattering teeth. "Sarah and the children. They can't stay warm. The fire's going strong, but the cabin, it's not enough." Anders didn't hesitate. He helped Tom inside. sat him by the hearth, and within minutes Tom stopped shaking enough to look around properly at the space he'd entered. The difference hit him like a physical thing, the warmth that surrounded him completely rather than in a single direction, the air that didn't bite at his lungs, the comfortable ease of it all. Anders handed him a cup of hot coffee, and Tom held it with both hands, not drinking at first, just absorbing the heat through his palms. When he could finally speak properly, his words came quiet. "How?" he asked, looking at the stone walls. "How is it this warm in here? My fire's been roaring all day, and I can still see my breath inside my own house." Anders explained as simply as he could, pointing at the walls and describing how they held heat, how the shape kept it moving evenly, how every element worked together. But Tom wasn't really listening to the technical details. He was feeling the proof of it, living the difference between Anders's solution and the traditional approach that had served loggers for generations but couldn't stand against this particular winter. "I mocked you," Tom said, staring into his coffee. "We all did. Called you foolish for building this stone puzzle when good timber was free for the taking." Anders shrugged. "You weren't wrong to doubt. I was asking you to believe in something you'd never seen. But you were right," Tom said. "And we were wrong. My family's freezing in a cabin that should work but doesn't. Not in this cold. And you're sitting here in your shirt sleeves like it's March." The validation Anders felt in that moment wasn't triumph or smugness. It was something quieter, a sense of being understood at last, of having his observation and logic confirmed in a way that words never could have achieved. Tom stayed perhaps an hour, warming himself thoroughly before facing the journey back to his family. Before he left, he clasped Anders's shoulder and said, "Tomorrow, if this cold holds, I'm bringing Sarah and the children here. Forge be damned, I won't watch them suffer when there's warmth to be had." Anders nodded. "The space is small, but there's room enough." The next morning, the temperature had somehow dropped even further, if such a thing was possible. Tom Bradford returned with his family, carrying the children wrapped in blankets, Sarah leaning heavily on his arm. They stepped into the stone cabin, and the relief was immediate and visible. The children, who'd been whimpering with cold, fell silent in wonder. Sarah, shaking with fever and chill, sank onto the bench Anders offered and closed her eyes, breathing in the warm air like medicine. Within the hour, other men began arriving, first just to see for themselves, then to ask if they might stay an hour or two to truly warm up. Anders welcomed them all, though his small cabin grew crowded quickly. They stood around looking at the walls they'd once mocked, running their hands over the stones that radiated steady heat, comparing the comfort they felt here to the desperate cold they'd fled from. The contrast was impossible to deny or explain away. Jack Merritt came by in the afternoon, stooping through the low doorway and standing in the center of the space, turning slowly to take it all in. He stayed silent for a long time before speaking. "I told you it'd be the warmest cabin in camp or the finest tomb," he finally said. "I suppose I owe you an apology for thinking the tomb more likely." The extreme cold lasted 5 days total before breaking slightly, though even the relief only brought temperatures back to merely brutal, rather than deadly. When it was over and the camp took stock, they found that several log cabins had suffered damage, gaps opened wider by the freeze, daubing fallen out in chunks, and most critically, wood supplies dangerously depleted. Anders's cabin had used maybe 30 logs total during those 5 days, while the other dwellings had burned hundreds. The difference in efficiency was so stark that men began doing calculations in their heads, figuring out what that would mean over a full winter, over multiple winters. The mockery that had followed Anders through the summer and fall died completely, replaced by a kind of respectful curiosity. By February, Tom Bradford had started planning his own stone cabin, asking Anders about angles and proportions. 3 other men joined the discussion, sketching ideas in the dirt, talking through how they might adapt the design for larger families or different sites. Jack Merritt, ever practical, suggested that the camp adopt the hexagonal stone design as standard for new construction, though he admitted the work involved meant they'd need to start early and perhaps build them cooperatively. The shift in the camp's attitude toward Anders was complete and unambiguous. Men who'd avoided him now sought his advice. Those who'd dismissed his summer's work now asked detailed questions about stone selection and wall construction. The social isolation he'd endured reversed itself, and Anders found himself at the center of a community that had learned, through the hardest of teachers, to value innovation over tradition when innovation proved itself so thoroughly. The extreme freeze of January 1884 became the measuring stick for shelter design in that camp and the surrounding region, the event that separated proven methods from merely traditional ones. Anders's original cabin served him faithfully for the remainder of his time in Minnesota, which stretched another 14 years until he moved west with the timber operations. During those years, he became known throughout the logging camps of the North as the man who'd figured out how to build warm, and his hexagonal design spread from crew to crew, adapted and modified, but always retaining the core principles he'd discovered. When Anders finally left the camp in 1898, the stone cabin remained, occupied by a series of families who appreciated its peculiar comfort. The structure stood well into the 20th century, outlasting the log cabins that had seemed so practical and traditional. In the 1920s, when modern logging operations finally moved into the area with steam power and new methods, old-timers would point out the weathered stone hexagon and tell the story of the Swedish stonemason who'd been laughed at for building it. Some said it stood until the 1940s, eventually collapsing more from abandonment than from any failure of design. The exact date of its end isn't recorded with certainty, but the knowledge Anders had stumbled upon, that observation about corners and heat, and the way stone could serve not just as foundation, but as salvation, that knowledge worked its way into the broader understanding of how to survive in the far north. His innovation, born from careful attention to the weakness in traditional design and the courage to build differently despite ridicule, became part of the practical wisdom that passed from one generation of frontier dwellers to the next. As we look back on Anders Lindström's story from this distance, it's impossible not to see the pattern that repeats throughout human history. Innovation often appears as foolishness until circumstance proves it wise. The man who observes what others overlook, who questions what everyone accepts, who commits to an idea despite social cost, that man is frequently dismissed as eccentric at best, dangerously misguided at worst. Yet when the test comes, when conditions push beyond the limits of tradition, it's the innovations that survive and the innovators who are remembered. Anders didn't have engineering degrees or scientific instruments. He had observation, experience with his craft, and the stubbornness to trust what he'd learned even when everyone around him trusted something else. His hexagonal stone cabin wasn't just a dwelling. It was a statement about the value of thinking differently, about respecting both traditional knowledge and personal observation, enough to know when the former needs updating with the latter. The logging camp's journey from mockery to adoption mirrors how communities everywhere grapple with change, how we cling to familiar methods until undeniable evidence forces us to adapt. The extreme cold of January 1884 was that evidence, brutal and definitive. It revealed the hidden weakness in structures everyone believed were sufficient, and it validated the man who'd seen that weakness and worked to solve it. In doing so, it taught everyone in that camp a lesson that extends far beyond cabin construction, a lesson about humility in the face of new ideas, about the difference between wisdom and habit, about the courage it takes to stand alone on an idea you believe in. There's something profound about preserving these stories, about keeping alive the memory of individuals like Anders Lindström, who solved impossible problems with nothing but what they had and what they could figure out. These weren't just survival techniques. They were acts of creative problem-solving under pressure, testaments to human adaptability and ingenuity. When we share these histories, when we take time to understand how a Swedish stonemason in a Minnesota logging camp changed the way his community thought about shelter, we're doing more than passing along interesting facts. We're honoring the human capacity to observe, to reason, to persist, and ultimately to improve upon what came before. If you found value in Anders's story, if you appreciate this glimpse into the practical genius of frontier life, consider subscribing to this channel so we can continue sharing these forgotten histories. Leave a comment about whether you've heard similar stories from your own family's past or your region's history. Those moments when someone did things differently and eventually changed minds through results rather than arguments. Hit the like button if you believe these stories of practical wisdom and determined innovation deserve to be remembered and passed forward. There are countless stories like Anders's waiting to be told. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things with observation and determination, and together we can make sure their ingenuity isn't forgotten. The frontier demanded innovation constantly, and the people who thrived there were the ones who could adapt, who could look at a problem everyone accepted and see a solution everyone missed. That spirit, that willingness to build something strange if it might work better. That's worth remembering and celebrating. Anders Lindström built his stone cabin one rock at a time, endured the ridicule of his peers, and ultimately proved that sometimes the wisdom of tradition needs the challenge of careful observation. His story reminds us that the difference between foolishness and genius is often just a matter of timing, of waiting for the right test to reveal what was true all along.